Hi everyone, I hope you can hear me okay. If not, then wait for something. I'm really excited to be here today. My name is Livia Tomova and I'm a research fellow at Cambridge. And today I get to introduce my research on unmet social needs and how that affects cognition and the brain. All right, so just to introduce the topic a bit, we know quite a lot that there's quite a lot of research showing that social interactions in and of themselves are rewarding for social species, including humans. So interacting with someone causes reward responses in people in and of themselves. The thing that we don't know quite well, however, is what are the effects of social disconnection on the human brain, or in general on human cognition? There is not as much research on that out there. So today in my talk, I will introduce this topic a bit and introduce two different studies that I've done in the past. The first one was looking at how isolation affects the human brain, and the second, how isolation affects cognition during development, specifically during adolescent development. So to address or to introduce the first study, I would like to give you a bit of background how we came about to study this question. So our colleagues were studying a very similar question in a mouse model, and they had really interesting and quite exciting findings, in my opinion. So they found that specific neurons in a brain region called the dorsal raphe nucleus, which is within our midbrain, which is a very basic region, in the mouse brain, whenever they would activate those neurons, the mouse would start to become more social, so would interact more with others, and when they inhibited those neurons, the mouse would be less social. And they found that these were kind of causal in driving social approach and termed them kind of loneliness-like neurons. So we were really intrigued by this finding, and we're asking ourselves, well, can we kind of set up an experiment that is similar and test this question in the human brain? So how is our drive to interact with others represented in our brains? So when designing the study, we ran into two main challenges. The first one was, well, can we evoke acute loneliness in humans in an experimental design so that we would be able to even study this question? We know that from human research that being alone, objectively alone, is not necessarily the same as being lonely. So people can spend time on their own but not feel lonely at all, while sometimes we can feel lonely even though we are in a crowd. So it's not necessarily that simple. So would we be able to set up an experiment where we would actually be able to test this question? And the second main challenge was, well, would we be able to measure the relevant brain signals with the methods that we have in human brain imaging? So to address the first main challenge, what we did was, well, we asked participants how they felt. So we asked people to spend 10 hours in a room on their own and had no real life or virtual social interactions. And during that time, every 2 hours, we asked them to fill out a questionnaire. And we asked them, how much do you crave social contact right now, and how lonely do you feel right now? And what we found was that, this doesn't work, okay, that both social craving and loneliness increased over the duration of how long they've been isolated. So in this specific setup, where we asked people to really not interact with anyone for this specific duration, we found that indeed, yes, we would be able to evoke acute loneliness in humans. To address our second main challenge about our methods for studying the brain, what we did was that we included a second condition as a proof of concept. So here we asked the same people who came into our lab and who we studied with the question of loneliness, we asked them to also fast on another day, so not eat anything for the whole day, and then we scanned their brains. And we did this in order to test, well, would we be able to find a neural signal of food craving in those people? And we chose food craving because it's a measure that has been done much more often, so we would be quite sure more or less what to expect. And indeed, what we found, focusing again on a very basic brain area within the midbrain, the substantia nigra, was that this brain area showed increased activation when people were fasting compared to when they were not fasted, when they were looking at pictures of food. And this activation also correlated with how much people self-reported that they wanted food. So obviously we are all a bit different, so whenever we fast, some people might feel very, very hungry afterwards or want food a lot, and others might care a bit less, so there is some variance in how people respond. And we found that this variance mapped on to how their midbrain responded. So it was directly a neural correlate of their subjective drive for wanting food. So this suggested to us that yes, we were able to measure neural signals of craving. So then we set out to test our actual question about loneliness. So what we found here was that, again, the substantia nigra showed increased activation in response to social images after people were isolated compared to when they were not isolated. And again, this activity, the amount of this activity correlated with how much people self-reported that they wanted, that they craved social contact. So this data looks pretty similar to the data that I was showing before, where we looked at the signals of fasting. So we were curious to ask the question more directly, well, how similar are those two neural signals actually? And to test this question, we used machine learning. So machine learning has the great advantage that it's really good in detecting similarities or differences between different images. And scans of the brain are essentially also images. So what we did was that we trained a classifier to identify neural signals of a hungry person looking at either food or control pictures. And then we tested this classifier that has been trained on those signals on neural signals of a person looking at social pictures versus control pictures. So importantly, the visual input, so what the person was seeing, was now different. But we were interested in seeing whether there is some similarity between the neural patterns of hunger and loneliness. So to test this question, we tested the classifier once on the data where people were looking at social pictures after isolation and once after baseline. So in one condition, they were isolated, and in the other, there was no deprivation. And indeed, what we found was that, yes, the classifier was able to, above chance, correctly identify neural signals of a lonely person looking at social cues or control cues, but it was not able to do that after baseline, so when there had been no deprivation of social contact. So this suggests to us that there is a shared neural signature between the neural patterns of hunger and loneliness. This research has provided evidence on a neural basis for this view that loneliness is not just a negative sensation that we have without any redeeming features, but actually it is a motivational drive. So this has been proposed by others before, but our data directly showed this within the brain. The idea here is that loneliness is a signal, just like hunger, that signals to us that something is lacking and that we need to take action to repair what is lacking, so to socialize again. So I will switch gears a bit now and talk about adolescence, because this is now understanding how this sort of motivational signal of loneliness impacts brain function is something that I'm specifically interested in studying in adolescents. So why is this the case? Why am I so interested in adolescence? So we know that adolescence is a quite unique period of our development. There's a shift happening during this time where adolescents reorient themselves away from their parents towards peers. So the main social contact starts, I mean, they're still obviously interacting with their parents and they're still important sources of their social connection, but peers become increasingly important during adolescence. And this is something that we see not only in humans, but also in other species. So interacting with peers has also been shown, primarily in animal research, to be really important for development of the brain. So we know that brain development continues until around the age of 24. And a lot of this is happening while adolescents interact with others. So these social interactions have been shown to be key for certain kinds of development of our brains. So the question then is, well, what does happen if adolescents are lonely, if they don't have these kinds of interactions that they are supposed to have? How does that affect their brain development? And indeed, this is a question that is nowadays quite relevant. So on this graph, I'm showing self-reported loneliness in a cohort of adolescents, or different adolescents, measured from the 1970s. So this, you can see on the axis below. Sorry, this does not work. Okay, you can see on the lower axis that it started to be measured from the 1970s until 2017. And we see the data for different age groups. And this is data from the US. What we see is that loneliness, self-reported loneliness, has been more or less similar for quite a long time, but until around 2010, there was a really steep increase in self-reported loneliness in adolescents. So there's a development happening, and it's not quite clear why. So some people have speculations. It might have to do with social media and virtual interactions, but it's actually not really clear why this is happening. In any case, we do see this kind of really strong rise in loneliness in adolescents. And this is not only true for the US, but also in other countries. So I don't have data on France now, but here we see that in the UK, for example, a quite large survey found that actually 40% of people in late adolescence, so 16 to 24 years, in the UK feel often or very often lonely. So this is almost every other person. And kind of understanding what this means, like what happens if so many people feel lonely is one of the goals that my research hopefully will achieve at some point. So while I said that we don't really quite understand how loneliness affects brain development, one thing that we do know or we have to rely on is research in animal models. So as I mentioned in the beginning, also animals go through a period that we call adolescence, and they have show relatively similar behaviors as human adolescents. So what people often, or researchers do, is that they study effects of loneliness or isolation in that case during adolescence in the mouse model. And what these studies have found, so there's really a lot of research actually on that, so the most consistent findings across these many different studies are, first of all, that isolation during adolescence leads to increased reward sensitivity. So this is a finding that is actually quite unique to adolescence. So isolation early in life has been shown to actually lead to the opposite. So animals show something more like anhedonia. So a decreased reward sensitivity. And later in life, the effects are just not that strong. But specifically during adolescence, if animals are not having the social interactions that they're supposed to have, they respond to it with increased sensitivity to rewards. And also increased anxiety. And those behavioral changes go along with modulations in serotonergic and dopaminergic brain systems, which we know that underlie these behavioral responses. So again, when kind of reviewing this research, we were curious, well, this kind of implies that isolation might have really severe and strong effects on adolescents, but also we need to kind of keep in mind that these are animal models. So is it really representative if a mouse that had been isolated for several days shows a different kind of behavior? Can we really directly translate that to humans? So I think this is not quite clear, and in order to shed more light on this, we now have just finished actually a study where we studied this question in human adolescents. So in this study, which was our Being Alone study, we recruited 40 participants between the ages of 16 to 19 years, and we asked them to undergo social isolation. So now the isolation period was a bit shorter because they were younger in age, but essentially it was very similar in the kind of setup that we had from the previous study I was introducing. And then after they either underwent isolation or a baseline session, we let them undergo behavioral testing. So we measured different kinds of behavioral responses in these adolescents in the kind of domains that have been shown to be affected by isolation in animal models. And one thing that we were also really interested in is, well, how does social media play into these effects? So if adolescents are isolated from real-life social interactions, but they have access to virtual social interactions, how does that affect the measures that we're taking in these behavioral tests? Do we see that perhaps access to social media remediates all the effects of isolation, or is there some unique effect happening there? And the third thing that we were really interested in was to study how these kinds of changes in behavior are associated with brain development. So each participant also underwent brain scanning at the beginning of the study, and our goal in this study was to look into, well, are differences in the kind of individual differences in how the brain is developed at this stage when participants come into our lab, do they predict how they respond to being isolated? So as I said, this study has just finished, so I cannot present the full data yet, but I will present our results on 2 of the tasks, which are both in the domain of reward processing. So before I do that, I will just show briefly the self-reported measures of loneliness in our experimental manipulation. As I said, isolation and loneliness are not necessarily the same thing, so we always make sure to also measure whether participants really feel lonely while they undergo isolation. And what we see from this graph is that over the duration of 3 hours of isolation, participants show an increase in their self-reported loneliness. And actually, this increase is pretty similar to the increase that we found in my previous adult study when adults were isolated for 10 hours. So it seems like, as we kind of expected, which is why we chose to do a shorter duration, it seems like adolescents are much more sensitive to being without social contact. So now looking at the data when participants had access to social media, what we see is that participants still report an increase in self-reported loneliness, but the increase is much less steep. So having access to social media actually made them feel less lonely. Right, so how does that now relate to the measures that we took at the end of the isolation? So I will start with the first task that we did, which was a task that is called effort expenditure for rewards. And essentially in this task, what we measure is how much effort are participants willing to undergo or to work for in order to obtain a reward, which is a kind of different measure than just asking someone how much do you want something, but how much would you be willing to work or actually work for something. So the task worked, I will just briefly show how the task worked. So first of all, we calibrated for each person how fast they were able to pump up a bar. So essentially they would be asked, press as fast as you can, and so on. So the number that they had, and then in the end, would represent the number that we would take then to calibrate easy or hard tasks for each participant. So that was done in order to make sure that each task was actually easy or hard for a person, because there might be individual differences in how people respond to this task. So what participants then saw was, for example, a prompt like this. So they would see a combination of effort and points. So points would be either 1 or 4, meaning that the reward that they get, and they would know that points would in the end translate to actual money. So the more points they would make in this task, the more they would be actually then paid in the end. And the different kinds of combinations were also then shown in a certain context. So either it was a social round or a nature round. And I will explain what that means just on the next slide. So if participants now chose to do this task, so an easy task in order to get 1 point, what they would see is something like that. So that would be a fraction of their maximum kind of response that they had, and they would be asked to pump up this bar, which would be quite easy, and then get the reward. So as you can see, so for example, this was now a social context. In addition to getting the point, so the monetary reward, participants would also be shown a picture. In the social context, it would be a picture of social interactions. In another possible round, so here you can see an example of a hard task where they can earn a high amount of rewards, 4 points, in a nature round. So again, if they were to decide they want to play this task, they would have to pump up this bar, which now would be much harder. And then if they win, they would get 4 points and would see 4 pictures. So this is now the final kind of reward setup. So essentially, participants, in addition to winning money, would get to look at pictures for a total duration of 8 seconds, so that was always the same. And when they won a high reward, they would get more pictures to look at, and when they won a low reward, there would be fewer pictures. So what did we then measure in this task? So our outcome variables here were, first of all, the choice. So how many times do participants choose to do the task, depending on the different kind of combinations of reward and effort. And the other was response time. So how fast were participants when they were deciding to do a task? And what we found was, so here I'm showing data for choice, so how often did participants choose to do a task? And what we see here is that participants chose to do a task depending on the amount of reward and the amount of effort that they were given. So on the graph, you can see the number of trials played across all participants. And on the x-axis, you can see it divided by high and low effort. And then the different bars represent high and low reward. So here we can see that for high effort, participants played many more tasks if the reward was high, and much fewer if the reward was low. And we see a similar pattern, but a bit more different for the low effort condition. So here participants played in general more tasks, and they still differentiated between high and low reward, but much less. So essentially, what we see is a kind of behavior that we would have expected. So we prefer to do a task when we get a lot of reward for it, or more reward, and if it's easier. Because the choice data actually in the end did not show a lot of variation, and we found that many participants actually often chose to do each task, which might have to do with differences in how adults versus adolescents respond to this kind of task, we then set out to test the response times in more detail. And what we saw was that there was an interaction between session, context, reward, and effort. So I will walk you through what that meant for this data. So here I will show only high effort data, because that's in the end where we found the effect, and divide it again by high and low reward. So in the social context, what we saw then across the different sessions, so now you can see on the y-axis the response time of participants, and lower means that they were faster. So if they were faster, that means that they were kind of showing a higher reward sensitivity in that condition. And this is divided by the 3 different sessions that participants underwent. And what we see is that, again, there is a difference between high and low rewards. So participants in general are faster to decide to play a task when the reward is high. But we see that this difference increased after isolation. So while in the baseline session, there is not that much difference, after isolation, they really differentiate. So this suggests to us that in social context, participants become more reward sensitive after isolation compared to baseline. So when we now look at the nature context, so non-social, what we see is a very different pattern. So while the social media and baseline condition look very similar to the social context, we see a completely different kind of responding after isolation. So now participants don't seem to really differentiate between high and low rewards anymore. And you see that it's almost the same. So this kind of suggests to us that it looks like participants become more reward sensitive after isolation, specifically if there is a reward that is tied to also a social reward. If the reward is not tied to a social kind of cue or reward, participants are actually less interested in rewards. Yeah, this is what I just said. And importantly, social media did remediate this effect. So we saw that if participants had access to social media during isolation, their responses in this task looked completely or more or less the same as during baseline, suggesting that it kind of whatever effect that we see happening in isolation is remediated through this access to social media. So now I will introduce the other task that I said I would talk about, which is reward learning. So in this task, participants would be asked to learn from feedback through trial and error. And the way this task looks like is that they were given these 2 slot machines, and they were asked to choose a slot machine without being told anything. They would just know that one would be rewarded to a higher extent than the other. And again, rewards would in the end translate to money. So when participants made several choices, they would either get a reward or not. And the reward contingencies were in a way that the one that was kind of the lower reward would be 20% of the time rewarded, and the other would be 80%. So then it would be a bit harder to learn which one is the better one, but in the end they should figure it out through trial and error. And then after several trials, the reward contingencies would shift. So now the other slot machine would be the one that gives you more rewards versus the other. And participants had to figure all of this out just through trial and error by being told, now you won or now you didn't win. So how this looked like in an actual or for a participant was that, for example, for a social feedback condition, participants would choose, and then they would get, for example, a face like this. So this face would mean they did not win. And then, for example, they would choose again, and they would get a face like this, which would smile, and that would tell them, now you won. Then we also had non-social feedback in this task, which was the same setup, but now the feedback would be a plus, so that would tell them, now you won, or a 0. So we were then interested in studying how well would participants learn this task, how would isolation affect that, and would it be different for when the feedback would be social or non-social. And the way we then analyzed the task was by using mathematical modeling of the trial-by-trial learning of participants. that gave us two different parameters. First one was a learning rate, so that would range either between 0 or somewhere between 0 and 1, which means how fast do participants learn, which slot machine gives them more rewards. And that could go from 0, where there was no learning, to 1, where there was perfect learning. The second parameter that we estimated was perseveration. So that means after the contingency is reversed, how quickly do participants change their behavior, or do they stick with the original response that they had already learned? And that could go, again, from 0 to 1, where there is no perseveration at 0, and a total perseveration, where they would never shift at 1. So what we found was then, now for the learning rate, at baseline, we saw that participants learned pretty well, actually, in general, but they learned also much better in response to social feedback. So we see that there is a much better learning happening if the feedback is faces rather than symbols. So when participants were undergoing isolation with social media, what we found was a relatively similar pattern. So we see that actually what we see is there is a ceiling effect. So participants improve their learning, and the difference between non-social and social learning is also the same kind of as in baseline. So they learn better from social feedback than from non-social feedback. So if participants now were isolated, what we found was that actually there was a much, much lower difference between the two types of learning, or the two types of feedback, I should say. So here it suggests, again, participants actually learned really well and much better than at baseline, but they did not differentiate as much between learning from social feedback versus from non-social feedback. So then looking at the perseveration, so you should please note that the the y-axis is now quite zoomed in, so essentially participants were quite good at this task, so they did not persevere much. But what we see is that at baseline, they were persevering more when the feedback was social. When participants then had access to social media, what we found was that these, the pattern of responses changed. So now they were much better after being given social feedback compared to non-social feedback. And after isolation, there was no difference anymore. So again, we see a similar pattern as for the learning. The participants, after they had been isolated, seem to not differentiate that much between social and non-social feedback in their learning. So to sum up, what we see is that, in general, adolescents learn better from social compared to non-social feedback. And after isolation, this difference becomes smaller, so the learning between social and non-social feedback is more similar. And access to social media in this task actually did have unique effects. So we found that participants showed an increased focus on social feedback. So they learned much, much better now to social feedback, while not so much better to non-social feedback. Okay. So just to sum up this study, and this is then the end of my talk actually already, what we see is that in adolescence, isolation increases sensitivity to social rewards. Isolation also decreases the benefit of social feedback for reward learning. And access to social media during isolation increases the focus on social feedback during reward learning. So to sum up in general, our results suggest that even short-term isolation impacts how adolescents process rewards, and social media partially remediates the effects, but not totally. All right, so I would like to thank all the collaborators on this research that I introduced today, and thank you all for listening. I'm happy to take questions if there are any.
Hi, thank you. I'm just wondering, in the conclusion from the second study, was it in some way contrary to what you expected? Because it seems a little bit contradictory to the first point, in which they're increasingly insensitive to social feedback, but then the reward is somehow less strong for them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think that is a really good point, and that is something that we are not quite sure how to interpret yet. It does seem like, I mean, I should say that these are two different processes. They are both tied into how we respond to rewards, but one is just, well, how sensitive am I to getting a reward versus how well do I learn from a reward. So I would say that the the results from the two tasks do not match completely. I agree with you, and I think it's quite hard to yet to explain what that essentially means. It suggests that maybe there's two different processes happening, that participants are more kind of focused in getting social rewards, but then when they actually have to perform a cognitive task, so learning something that is not that easy, they seem to perhaps not focus so much on social feedback yet. I mean, I think my interpretation now is not too, is a bit shallow at this point, because we are actually quite puzzled by this finding. And I think so our goal now, or our aim for our next steps, is to look at more closely into individual differences in how participants responded to the task. So perhaps looking at differences by gender or other like pre-existing depression or things like that will kind of explain these results in a bit of a better way.
Yes, thank you. So maybe I got it wrong, but my feeling is that maybe you have a ceiling effect, in the sense that, because you are saying that the result that there is no difference, so in the desensitivity between social or no social content, it could be just related to the fact that you have, because in all the results, the subjects in social isolation are either faster, learn faster also, and I don't remember, and also don't change, don't have the perseveration. And so you could have this absence of difference just because you reach a scale that you cannot see a difference, because they are already the better that they can get. So if the task would be harder, maybe you would see a difference.
Yeah, that's a good point, and I think, so let me just go back to this slide. So here. So for sure, I do think what we see is a ceiling effect here for the learning rate in the social media condition. So this is why I was showing the feedback to the data divided by feedback, because I should add that the baseline task was always the first task, so the first session, sorry, and then they did the other two sessions. So the difference between here, baseline, and the other two is not too surprising, so we think this is actually a practice effect. If I have done this task a second time, I will be better. And they're actually really good at this task, so here I for sure think this is a ceiling effect. The other result here, I think, is more tricky to interpret, because both the social media and the isolation session were done as the second or third session, so this was counterbalanced. So I don't think that necessarily, so we shouldn't interpret the overall improvement, but the difference between the social and non-social is the thing that I think is crucial here. And here we do see that in one we still have this really big difference, while in the other not. So I would say that this is our main effect here. I hope that made sense.
So if the effect of social isolation is an increase in motivation, so dependent on the social feedback or not, you are just more motivated. And because you cannot perform better, you wouldn't see a difference, no?
Yeah, I mean, that could certainly be the case, that perhaps they were just motivated to learn from social and non-social feedback equally well. The interesting part then would be, though, that we don't see that after social media. So if there is a ceiling effect and there is no change in this, we certainly don't see that in the social media condition.
Thank you for your talk. I wanted to ask about the isolation period that the subjects had to go through. Did they have did they have things to do in the isolation condition that were non-social, or I mean, what did they have to do when they weren't in isolation? Is there a contrast for this? And maybe also about the questionnaire you gave them, was it specifically focused on them reporting loneliness or not, or was it more open, maybe?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so this is a really important question, and I should have mentioned it in the when I was introducing the session. So yes, participants did have things to do during isolation, so we encouraged them to bring anything they wanted to have so they would not be bored, because our main kind of focus was not necessarily on boredom, obviously, but on the effects of loneliness. Although I should say that what we still see quite a lot is that there is an increase in boredom when participants are isolated. And we've had that also in my other study, and I have been thinking about this for quite a while. And one thing that seems to happen is that we can try to dissociate effects of boredom and effects of loneliness, I think only to a certain extent. I think what is loneliness in a sense as a feeling as well is also feeling kind of bored. So it looks like a certain level of diminishing boredom can only ever happen when we get to interact with others. So I think it is somehow, well, it's not necessarily possible to dissociate those two completely. But so we tried in our experiment to do that as much as possible and encourage participants to bring anything they wanted to still have them entertained. And your second question was, sorry, I forgot it now.
You said you wanted to see if isolation could reduce loneliness, and that you showed it did by giving people a questionnaire reporting if they were lonely. But I mean, if the questionnaire only asked people whether they were craving social contact, maybe they were going to focus on this and, you know, rate it higher than they would if the questionnaire was very large, and then you picked up the effect among other things.
Yeah, this is a really good point as well. So we did ask other things as well. We asked, so in general, we asked across several different emotions how they changed during loneliness. So, during isolation. So loneliness was one of them. But we also asked, for example, anxiety and sadness and things like that. So what we did see is that, in general, isolation is not a pleasant experience to participants, so they do tend to show an increase in negative emotions and a decrease in positive emotions. I do think also, though, I mean, I think your point is really good about, well, you asked them about it, so they might focus on it. And I mean, I think to a certain extent, we do have this effect in these experiments, because obviously participants are aware what we're testing if they're asked to be alone in a room. So I think we cannot abolish this kind of expectation that they should focus on loneliness 100%. And I think this is kind of a shortcoming of this kind of study, but I think it's really also tricky to set up this kind of experiment without having participants know it's, yeah. I think that there's always a bit of a pro and con when, so either we look into an experimental kind of setup, which in a way is hard to make completely the same as a real-life experience of loneliness, but it's really good for being able to control parameters. So then we can test causality, versus we look completely just in how like real-life loneliness relates to certain things. So then we have a very valid measure of loneliness, but there's no control, so all kinds of things could drive it. So we're trying to get somewhere to the sweet point of this. Yeah. I think there was another.
Yes, hello, thank you. So, I mean, how would you explain the effect of social media, like in the adolescents, and in particular, I mean, regarding like one of the subjects that raised this research program, if I understand, was the COVID impact. So, like, what do you think would be the midterm or like, yeah, the consequences of that for the adolescents that faced this pandemic in the last 2 years?
So your question was first about how I interpret the social media effects. Yeah, so I think what this data shows is, first of all, that social media to some extent can remediate effects of isolation. So participants self-report that they feel less lonely when they have access to social media or any kind of way of interacting with others virtually. And they, for example, the effects that we had in this in the effort task, we did not see them at all if participants were able to interact with others. So it looks like, and this is kind of what we hypothesized, that social media to a certain extent can kind of make us feel connected to others. It also seems that perhaps not completely, because we do see these effects in that task where it looks like it's almost a unique effect of social media, where participants show this kind of reversal of the effects here. So while they here were actually not that good to social feedback, they really strongly improve. And it suggests that perhaps they show an increased focus on social cues after interacting with others only virtually. I mean, I think these kind of results certainly need a follow-up study and replication and understanding better what this actually means. It's kind of hard to just take it from there, but I think it's important to, well, to first try to assess this in any way other than just by self-reports. So this is what we have mostly at the moment when people are studying effects of social media. What we actually have is screen time, which is even worse because that just means the duration of time you spend in front of a screen, which is the dependent or the independent variable then for explaining all kinds of effects. And this is a really, I think, terrible way to study it because screen time could mean so many different things. Like I could do so many different things in front of my screen on my phone. So I think it tells us very little what actually happens when people engage with social media. So our studies here are kind of a first approach to start to get into this on a more controlled way and seeing how, well, what does happen actually if I only have this kind of social interaction. And I think it ties a bit into a more broader question, and I think that also is then related to your second question, which is about the pandemic. Like, what does it actually mean to be connected with others? So this is a question that I've been asking myself, like, from these studies. So what is it about social interactions that really make us feel connected? Like, it could be a lot of different things, and social interactions can look very different, right? But are there certain features that these social interactions must have so that I feel connected to others? And which ones are they, if they are, or which combination of features? And to what extent, then, can virtual interactions actually also, well, will show the same kinds of features? So for example, if I give an example, so one thing that people have proposed is that, well, positive social feedback is something that makes a social interaction very rewarding. So we could get that, in theory, from a virtual social interaction. And we know from studies with fMRI that people in a scanner environment, when they just see faces smiling at them from others, will respond with a reward response. So it looks like maybe perhaps even very isolated features of social interactions are enough to satisfy our social needs. But I think we don't really know, and I think this is what I'm in a very long way explaining, that we don't know yet. I think in terms of the pandemic, one thing that, I mean, we do see is that mental health has deteriorated in young people, and not being able to interact with others, certainly, I would say, is not ideal and perhaps even harmful. It could be that virtual interactions are a way to kind of mitigate these effects. So we know that already young people interact with their friends quite a lot via social media. Even if they have the possibility to interact with them in person, a lot of them will actually choose social media because they have their unique ways of interacting, like with online gaming, for example. So I think it is perhaps a way to mitigate these effects, but one thing that we really don't know is, well, how well does this work? And I don't have the answer to that. I think we need more research to understand this better. Okay, so if there are no more questions, or is there? Oh, I don't know. No? Okay. Well, thank you all for listening then. And thanks for the great questions.